Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 29th. And I hope you all had a long, enjoyable weekend. And we are in the tail end of the semester, believe it or not. I wanted to talk a little bit about the haunting today. And since we've fallen a little bit behind, I wanted to give an extension for that journal. That would be journal number 6 for the haunting. That will now be due this upcoming Wednesday, which is the 1st of December, 11:59 p.m., via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And in terms of The Haunting of Hill House, we watched the production The Haunting, and there is a remake of that, but it's not nearly, I think, as well done, even though the special effects of the remake are probably superior for obvious reasons. And one of the things that I think we see with The Haunting, as many of you had indicated in your attendance question, is that the decision to call the film The Haunting makes it much broader than just thinking about the house itself, because certainly Ellie is a haunted character. And haunting, as I believe we had talked about before, the word haunt comes from home. And this is supposed to be some kind of inexplicable sensory phenomenon, more often than not noises, smells, tactile sensations, things like the cold, and perhaps possible poltergeist activities. And we can see how all of that is applicable in The Haunting of Hill House. Of course, we've got nice alliteration there with the H's, haunting, hill, and house. Some have speculated that what a haunting is that it's energy residue that's left behind by the living after death. A house can kind of retain a sort of psychic memory as a kind of psychic battery, if you will. It's an idea that Stephen King examined further in The Shining with the Overlook Hotel, if you're familiar with that text. And it could also be a haunting, a possible portal to a spirit dimension, allowing spirits to enter into our physical world. Now, in terms of poltergeist, and again, I believe that I covered this before, this comes from the German word poltern, which means to knock, and Geist, which is spirit. It's supposed to be a mischievous, sometimes malevolent, but more often than not, mischievous spirit or energy. Things like rock throwing. Think about how that's applicable with what we saw with Ellie. Odors, raps, sometimes physical or sexual assaults, shrieking, and the spontaneous movement of objects, usually associated with a female under the age of 20 in adolescence. And speculation has been that poltergeist activity could be the unconscious thoughts or the repressed emotions of the individual, hostility and anger, for instance. And certainly we see Ellie has a good amount of that. She's not the right age, obviously, but one of the things I'll note about the text when we talk about it is that she lies about her age and she makes herself basically older. And that's usually something that younger people do, and it's something that oftentimes teenagers do. We could argue that Ellie is, in many respects, very adolescent-like, even though she may not necessarily have the age of adolescence. She certainly has the personality and the intellect of an adolescent. And poltergeists are oftentimes associated with physical disturbances, things like flying or levitating, banging doors, rapping, thumping, assaults on a human, either themselves or someone else. Keep this in mind when we transition into our last text of the semester, our last major text of the semester, The Exorcist. And some arguments have been that poltergeist activity is really caused by a kind of psychokinesis. In other words, the ability to harness strengths of the mind that most of us are not able to necessarily do, but a few of us can. So the text, as I suggested, is really a great character study of a repressed individual, and this is Ellie. We know that Ellie's background, she's been the caretaker for her mother. Her mother has just recently passed. Ellie's never really been on her own. She feels a good amount of guilt over her mother's death. Also some relief over her mother's death because she was a caretaker. Ellie lives with her sister's family. Again, in many ways, very adolescent, not having her own independence. Very sheltered. Again, she lies about her age. She's really 34, but she says she's 32. Very awkward and sheltered, prone to a very active fantasy life, which perhaps could be one of the reasons why Hill House is attracted to her, if there are indeed supernatural phenomena that are going on, because of Ellie's instability of character and her ability to live in an alternate reality. And when she was 12, after her father's death, stones fell on the house. And of course, that could be a sign of some kind of supernatural or poltergeist activity. Theodora, who goes by the nickname Theo, very male name, is the exact opposite of Ellie. She's very independent, she's very confident, she's very graceful. She says she lives with a, quote, friend, unquote. And there has been readings of this particular text that have suggested that Theo and Ellie have some sexual tension between the two of them. And there's a scene that oftentimes is highlighted as a possible erotic scene between them that I'll highlight in a moment. And her talent, so to speak, is that Theo was able to identify cards in a lab experiment. And through telepathy, which is the vicarious transmission of information without using traditional sensory channels. So, and you can see all of this in the notes below. Now, the opening quote, and notice how the text begins and ends in the same way. It's very circular in many respects. And I had asked you to watch a little bit about the Winchester Mystery House. And you know that Hill House was very loosely based on the Winchester Mystery House in terms of its oddities with architecture. But there are also references to the circular nature of not just the Winchester Mystery House and the circular nature of this narrative, but if you're familiar with Dante's Inferno and the Circles of Hell, of course, the author would have been very skilled and in knowing these things and trying to portray them in a supernatural tale. But we know that supernatural tales oftentimes come with ambiguity, and that's exactly what we see here, is that this could be explained away through natural means, unlike Lovecraft, where it was very clearly a supernatural event. Or this could be something that is of supernatural origin. Personally, I like to think that both are occurring at the same time. And Stephen King talks a little bit about this in Dance Macabre, and he has the same perspective, that it's quite possible that we've got a unstable Ellie, but we also have supernatural phenomenon going on at the same time. And they both feed off of one another. But the opening quote, "No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality." The idea that, of course, a certain amount of escapism is necessary. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. And of course, the suggestion that we've got with Shirley Jackson's text is that perhaps it's Ellie herself that is going to be walking in Hill House, that this has become her home, which is something else that I'll be discussing in terms of the text, the messages that Ellie receives about home. We're introduced to a Dr. Montague, and notice how he's portrayed rather differently in the film, and he becomes a kind of pseudo love interest in the film version. Very typical of Hollywood to want to supply a romance, and particularly a heterosexual romance, which is not what Shirley Jackson had intended. And Dr. Montague is very much like a Van Helsing figure in that he's able to embrace the scientific and also the supernatural, but he's presented as a rather ridiculous figure who is mocked, and he certainly is not respected in the academic community. And Mrs. Montague, who also appears quite differently in the text, is basically very much the domineering wife, and he plays the role of the henpecked husband. So it's in some ways Mrs. Montague serves as a kind of comedic relief in a way that we don't necessarily see in the film, where she's just more of a skeptic. And the idea of renting Hill House for 3 months, think about the significance of three and associations with Trinity, which again, Shirley Jackson would have been quite aware of when she used this number. And then, unlike Victorian times, Montague is forced to search for assistance. So that's a little wink and a nod to the old Gothic tradition, the Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Think about something like Dracula, where I always like to joke that it just seems that everybody has enough time and resources to take off months to begin searching for a vampire. That's not reality. But now we see also that it's not reality to assume that individuals will willingly embrace the supernatural and want to do so. He's forced to search for assistance. Hill House is in an isolated rural area. We already know that isolation is a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. And the house is described in very Gothic terms, much like the Gothic architecture that has helped to formulate the tradition of Gothic that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. It has towers and turrets and buttresses and spires and gargoyles. Gargoyles, by the way, were actually used to ward off evil spirits. Odd angles. Keep in mind how Lovecraft had talked about, or I believe that I had talked about how Lovecraft talked about, that angles were the ways that one could enter into a different dimension. There's personification, very Poe-like as well, that the windows are like eyes and the cornices are like eyebrows. I would argue that Hill House itself is actually a character in this particular story, much more so than what we saw in the film. Doors swing shut, and doors can be viewed from a symbolic perspective. We talked about this with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as a kind of entrance or doorway into the psyche. And of course, the reference to the circular nature and Dante's Inferno that I was referencing earlier. And more often than not, haunted tales and ghost stories have some sort of tragic history of the past associated with them. Keep in mind, one of the elements of the Gothic is that the past oftentimes is invading the present. And the tragic history is that the last tenant died crashing into a driveway tree. And of course, that has significance because, and I hope by this point you've finished reading the novel, this is how Ellie dies as well. Whether or not this is through her own volition or whether or not she's being controlled by an outside force or a combination of the two, we can never completely be certain. And all of the tenants who've ever stayed at Hill House leave quite hastily, and none of them really want to talk about why. The builder, Hugh Crane, was eccentric to say the least. His first wife died in a driveway carriage accident. Again, notice the parallels with accidents in the driveway. Second wife died of a fall. Think about how Ellie at one point could have easily fallen in the library stairs. And the third wife died of consumption in Europe. And keep in mind, we talked a little bit about consumption and tuberculosis when we were talking about vampirism, that oftentimes many of the symptoms of consumption, of being drained of energy and being very pale, were the same symptoms that were supposed to be associated with vampirism. There were quarreling sibling heirs about the house and the heirlooms. This is a very traditional idea in ghost stories, that it has something to do with some sort of injustice around an inheritance. Supposedly, the older sister died in the house because the companion neglected her. And keep in mind, again, parallels with Ellie's own situation with her own mother, and who was knocking on the wall, and Ellie just didn't answer that one evening. And that the companion was willed the house, and eventually she hung herself in the tower turret. And notice too in Hill House, the rooms are named after colors. Very Poe-like. Think about the Mask of Red Death. Again, Shirley Jackson would have been very familiar with this. We're at the point in the semester now where we've got some more contemporary authors basically paying homage to some of the earlier masters in the Gothic. It's one of the reasons why I had structured the class from a chronological perspective so that you could see the progression. The group, they spend some time playing chess, and might I suggest that that's basically what the house is doing with them, using these inhabitants as chess pieces and playing games with them. It's an old idea that you can find in Shakespeare as well about game playing, and that people play games much like they can play parlor games or board games. They spend time reading mystery stories. Keep in mind that Poe has been credited with creating the first mystery story. And there's a little wink and a nod here to one of the first British novels named Pamela that is notoriously long and boring. So when you've got a character like Montague saying that he brought Pamela with him to keep him occupied, then we know that this is going to be for a long stretch of time. Mrs. Dudley happens to be one of my favorite characters, and I have to say that I think the film version we saw nails it with that particular actor. She's supposed to represent order. You know, she clears breakfast at 10 and lunch at 1 and dinner at 6. And of course, she helps to add to the spooky atmosphere by giving the warnings that nobody really wants to be at Hill House after dark. Again, it almost reminds me of some of the warnings Jonathan got about avoiding Castle Dracula, which of course he ignored, and that was to his detriment. So we see this story through Ellie's eyes, and we can see that Ellie is quite challenged in a number of ways. And not only is she lying about her age, which is in some ways very adolescent, as she's adding years to it, she lies about having her own apartment, and again, that's usually one of the biggest goals of an adolescent is to achieve independence. She fights with her sister over the car, and think about how cars represent independence and freedom. She's constantly afraid of being left out of the group, of being isolated, not being part of the clique. She often wonders, what would my mother say about things? Again, that's very much like adolescent thinking. And spends a good amount of time wondering when she will be the center of attention in this group. When will others talk about her? The text begins where she's alone and she ends up running into an old lady with groceries. And it's an interesting episode because the woman says that she's going to pray for Ellie. I suspect that Ellie is so alone and isolated. This might be the only person that would pray for Ellie. It also is a little bit of foreshadowing because Ellie is indeed going to need prayers when she goes to Hill House. And we learn a little bit about her history, about the supernatural and paranormal phenomenon that occurred at age 12. Again, the perfect age for poltergeist activity. And Ellie lives in a fantasy world of superstitions and omens. We see this as she's driving along. She sees the word daredevil, and what she sees is dare evil. Or phrases, these trite expressions that she repeats over and over again, like journeys end in lovers' meetings. And of course, you might argue that her lover, so to speak, becomes Hill House. One important little detail in this novel, we're told that she takes a box with her when she goes to Hill House. And then at the ending of the novel, we're told that all of her possessions are in that box. And I think that's quite telling. First of all, that all of her possessions would fit into a box. And secondly, if she's taking all of her possessions with her when she goes to Hill House, she's not planning on returning. So this gives you a sense of her state of mind when she leaves. We see how oftentimes she's seeking verification of existence and verification of reality. So she has a very thin grasp on the real world. The episode where she's driving and she stops for some coffee and she observes a little girl demanding her cup of stars, I think is also very telling because Ellie has great admiration for this girl for being able to stand up to authority and be able to voice her needs, something that Ellie's never really been able to do. And in fact, there's a quote, once they've trapped you into being like everybody else, you'll never see your cup of stars again. The cup of stars being basically a kind of symbol for independence. And of course, as we learn a little bit more about Ellie by the ending of the story, one could say that it's a suicide as she crashes her car into the tree after she has been humiliated and exiled from Hill House. This is a way that she can stay with Hill House forever. But there are enough supernatural phenomenon that would seem to suggest that Hill House is also trying to control her, perhaps because she's the weakest of the group. The setting, it's the first shining day of summer. So this kind of upsets expectations. It's June 21st. It's the summer solstice, which is midsummer, which is a very important day from a pagan perspective. It's a day of fertility and celebration of fertility. It oftentimes is considered to be a very erotic day, and it is perhaps again related to Ellie's repression, which includes sexual repression as well as repression on other levels. Ellie turns left in the directions, and there's a long tradition that left is associated with evil. She's traveling west. Again, the idea that this is where the sun sets. So all of this setting, again, very deliberately done by Shirley Jackson. We're given a definition on page 159 of fear, which I think is a wonderful definition. It's the relinquishment of logic, the willing relinquishing of reasonable patterns. And Luke basically says what we fear most is seeing ourselves clearly and without disguise. And notice that that is an idea that we've been playing around as well, and that we wear facades. We saw something like that when we were talking about Edgar Allan Poe. The stories that Ellie tells about herself, I think also are quite telling. That she tells how she, as a child, she had freckles, and that's considered to be some sort of, if not disfigurement, something that would not be considered to be indicative of beauty. That she has, in one way or another, been soiled. She's often sick with colds. She fell during her graduation procession. Notice the contrast with Theo. Well, Theo attended private school, learned how to curtsy, attended dances, and performed in operetta. So they are as polar opposite as one can get. But the fantasy stories Ellie tells about herself, that she's in love, she was once an artist model, she was living a mad and abandoned life, and her affairs were the talk of the cafes when they're all amusing each other by telling these outlandish stories that are fictional about themselves, I think says a lot about Ellie's insecurities and also Ellie's desires. And notice how she's talking about things like affairs, which can have a dual meaning. Affairs can just mean business, but affairs can also be a sexual relationship as well. And Theo and Ellie's relationship, it's at one point Ellie asks Theo if Theo is married, and Theo's response is silence, a laugh, and then the word no. Again, very subtle suggestions. And Theo is at Hill House because she's had an argument with her, quote, friend, unquote. Again, the suggestion is that Theo is lesbian. And the only reason why she's at Hill House is because she's had a romantic dispute. As opposed to Ellie, the reason why she's at Hill House is because, well, frankly, this is the only thing that's ever happened to her, as she has said. And the quote that I wanted to reference on page 174 about the possible erotic tension between Ellie and Theo. Nothing irrevocable had yet to be spoken, but there was the barest margin of safety left them, each of them moving delicately along the outskirts of an open question. And once spoken, such a question as, "Do you love me?" could never be answered or forgotten. They walked slowly, walking side by side, in the most extreme intimacy of expectation. Their fainting and hesitation done with, they could only wait passively for resolution. Each knew almost within a breath what the other was thinking and waiting to say. Each of them almost wept for the other. And again, this is something that usually is not addressed in Hollywood versions for obvious reasons. We talked about this with Jekyll and Hyde as well in movie versions. We learn a lot of lore about the supernatural. So we learn about things like haunted house lore and Ouija boards. And I'll quote some of that for you next class. And that message that Ellie receives, help Eleanor come home. And notice there's no punctuation here, and punctuation would completely change the possible meanings of this sentence. Is it that Eleanor is asking for help? Is it that the house or some sort of entity is saying that Eleanor needs to be helped? And the idea of coming home, and what is home? Is this the idea of the home with her mother and her sister? Or is Hill House now calling out to Ellie, asking for home? And perhaps Hill House is asking Eleanor for help. So lots of different ways to read this. And of course, the ambiguity of it could be that Ellie wrote it herself. There certainly are enough suggestions that it's a possibility. Things like the ripped clothes aren't ripped anymore, and yet we have individuals who are all seemingly experiencing the same phenomenon, eyewitnesses. So that would seem to suggest that the events are occurring, unless you wanted to believe something like a group psychosis, which is oftentimes used to explain away inexplicable events. That a group of individuals can basically create a fantasy reality for themselves and truly believe it, particularly if the circumstances are correct, if they are isolated, they are on edge, and we see both in here. But of course, that doesn't explain some of the history of the house. Whether Ellie is deliberately doing these things, subconsciously doing these things, has invited in some sort of poltergeist activity, group psychosis, or the house is responsible. And I'd like to think all three at the same time, because that gives a certain level of complexity to the story. I think that considering what we have read in Hill House, today's attendance question is going to be about what you think it has happened and what the explanation is for the events. So the attendance question will be due Tuesday, as it usually is. That'll be on the 30th of November, 8 a.m. Again, if you need an additional extension or additional time, just let me know. What do you think is the explanation for the events at Hill House, and why? What do you think is the explanation for the events at Hill House, and why? I've shared with you some of my beliefs, but I'd be curious to hear what some of your beliefs are. And then what we will do next class is I will finish up with some quotation from The Haunting of Hill House, and then we will move to our last major text, which happens to be The Exorcist. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.